Hey everyone, Matt Sitter from AFN here. Great to see you all. Our fundamental belief at AFN is that change is where opportunity happens, and the best way to find opportunity in change is a network that's diverse in experience, expertise, and perspective. Part of what we like to do with AFN is bring a bunch of different perspectives together at one time. That's one of the reasons why we do panels and we do fireside chats. Today, we're going to be talking about integrated healthcare and how that's actually impacting a number of the entrepreneurs that we work with within AFN. So today, we've got a really good group of folks with us. Just quick introductions for us. We've got Chris Barker, CEO of Spirit Healthcare in the UK. Ron Dixon, CEO of CareHive, Greg Cangialosi, CEO of Twilight, and Ben Clayton, CEO of LifeFlight, and finally, Jacob Philip, CEO of MedLever. Welcome, guys. Thanks a ton for being on today.
Our pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
And we have a number of questions that we'll go through, but for folks who are listening in, if you want to submit questions in the chat, please feel free to do so as we go through. If we've got time at the end, we'll actually allow people to come in live against it. So, one of the reasons why we actually pulled this panel together was all of us voiced some sort of frustration with the idea that digital healthcare is no longer a relevant term for us because it's integrated in absolutely everything. So our focus is on integrated healthcare and how we are making use of stuff in the digital world to help us out in the real world. So where I wanted to start was just trends in the real world and thinking about how that is impacting just what we see in care overall. Ben, I'd like to go to you first. So thinking about what's going to happen over the next 10 years, one of the things that we're seeing in the United States and in many parts of the world is people moving towards urban centers. LifeFlight provides a service to help people get from rural areas or from certain hospitals to other hospitals. How do you see that type of trend impacting you guys in the future?
Yeah, one of the things that we see, particularly as healthcare costs keep rising, employment, labor costs keep rising, is that a lot of the rural hospitals, rural clinics reduce services because they just can't afford to keep them open. We had an example in Baker City, Oregon, where they cut out the maternity care in that entire city. And so now it's a maternity care desert there. And so the choice is to go to Boise or to go to Pendleton or Portland, even Spokane, far away places. And we operate largely rural areas. So as we see these reduction in services, it makes transport more important, which is an interesting aspect. And it's unfortunate that a lot of these rural places are seeing a reduction in services.
And maybe if you can just give us a sense on the distance when you're saying that they're closing down maternity care in this area, if they've got to go to Boise,
it's like a 6-hour drive, right? And if they're going to drive it 6 hours, we can fly them there obviously in an hour. But at some point, if it's a high risk OB patient, at some point you don't want them in an aircraft, right? So they've got to make that decision proactively and early in order to get them to the care that they need. So it's a challenge. And the West is a very large with long distances, and in winter roads it can become problematic. Oftentimes we'll have highways where they close in the winter, the passes close due to snow. So it's an issue.
All right. And so you see services actually diminishing overall in rural areas by virtue of this. And you brought up maternity care. Any other important areas of care that you think we're going to see more rapidly diminishing?
Yeah, I mean, I think anything with heart attack, stroke, cath labs, those types of things that require specialists that in these areas, it's going to become tougher and tougher to have specialists in some of the rural areas.
Well, and I think some of the things that you're talking about, heart attack or stroke, the speed at which you actually address those is more important, right? And so we can get in this vicious cycle where, if you're an older person and you're worried about those things, you probably got to move away from those areas.
Which is unfortunate because people want to retire to a rural area, and we see it a lot on the veteran community as well, where veterans like to live in rural areas typically or oftentimes, and so they're getting their access to care reduced as well.
All right, so one trend is we see urbanization increasing. That's going to impact care in a lot of ways, particularly in those areas that are out on the edges of where people are living. Greg, thinking about our aging population.
Yeah.
Um, so, obviously in the United States, we're seeing aging. We're seeing that in, almost everywhere except for Africa, where, the populations overall are going to be aging substantially.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about this trend of an aging population.
So, thanks, Matt. The way I'm kind of approaching, I think our solution to this is really a consumer first version of focusing on the family caregiver that's typically involved with navigating the health journey of our aging population. Once someone gets to the point where there's assistance that's needed and either a decision is made to age at home or to do a transition of care to assisted living, whether that's independent assisted, and then where they go from there. And what I think one of the trends that I'm seeing, I'm certainly trying to drive from what we're building over here at Twilight, is to kind of democratize the data for caregivers to understand really what's going on. So typically, caregiving has really been, and those who have experience with this know this, a very reactive state. And so there's a lot of room for error. There's a lot of room for mistranslation of information and transitions of care. There's just a lot of what I like to call Swiss cheese opportunities to miss how to navigate care properly for the folks that we're advocating for, in some cases when they can't advocate for themselves. So the democratization of the data, getting the caregiver or the family caregiver or the representative authorized AOR of that person to have access to their healthcare information, understand their medications, their doctors, their conditions, look at their history, understand who they are, what they've been through, and where they're maybe going, and be able to influence that from an empowered and confident way versus a completely reactive, I'm in the dark, I have no idea, which is the norm today, way. I think as we're seeing more and more, we're going to see more and more consumers come to the front line with being able to access these digital tools. And to your point, everything's digital now, right? It's about really how we leverage the data and get it into the hands of the right people in the right format at the right times, and try to provide a connection really for the first time between the providers, the caregivers, and ideally the payers. I know that's a little bit of a word salad, but there's a bunch of trends in there that I believe are all intersecting. And from a technical perspective, I think the interoperability that we're finally seeing in healthcare is going to enable a lot of that to happen.
Well, and I think, when you're talking about the aging of the population, the burden is being felt in an increased way on these caregivers. What I think what you see is like the physicians, the healthcare system isn't sufficient to actually provide care to these people. You have to have someone stepping in and advocating, and that demand is going to go up.
Yeah, like a friend of mine, Anisha, said we're really at the end of the day health information fiduciaries, right? I mean, I'm not a caregiver per se. I don't do the actual care for my mom, right? But I'm her health information fiduciary, and I act as the quarterback for making sure whoever's involved in her care knows, and I know everything that's going on in her care. And that should not be a daunting task in 2024 going into 2025. This should be easily accessible. You may need some help with interpretation. You may need to have broader resources around you to be able to navigate this. But having the basics, and you and I have joked a lot. It's funny. It's not funny. It's that I sometimes joke that I'm building a technology that tells people who their doctors are, what medications they're on, and what conditions they have. Like that should not be, trivial at this point. But yes, and then also I think, with the caregiver becoming more and more recognized as a pivotal point in navigating care, there's legislation that's going on here in the U.S. where the caregivers finally get recognized because the burnout and obviously the toll that it's taken. From a mental health perspective, a physical health perspective, a family perspective, and a professional loss of productivity perspective, there's just more than a case to be made that we need more help here. And so where we stand from Twilight is trying to provide some digital infrastructure that we can stitch some of these pieces together and allow caregivers to navigate the journey with, I said, more confidence and from more of an empowered perspective.
Well, and there's so many different pieces.
Matt,
go ahead.
Last week I was at the first kind of Dartmouth Healthcare Innovation Conference, and one of the big things that came out of this actually, and I guess it's a shout out to Greg, was the need for some entity to navigate for people who are taking care of loved ones in the home, especially loved ones at kind of the end of life, whether it's from a terminal illness or Alzheimer's, etc. So I think I need to connect Greg to Dartmouth because they're actively looking for solutions to actually invest in this arena. So really important stuff.
Thanks, Ron.
All right, good win right there.
I know it's great.
Staying with the idea of the aging population,
Yeah.
Jacob, you just got back from a radiation oncology conference, and we know that cancer hits aging populations disproportionately. And we see so that population that's getting cancer is going to grow. What are people saying about the growing aging populations and how hospitals are going to be able to deal with this and continue to deliver quality care in a way that extends and hopefully keeps quality of life high?
Yeah, that's a great set of questions there to answer, and I think there's several factors involved here. We started out the question about people moving into more of an urban environment, so there's the shift from rural to urban, which is actually moving a lot of the access to care issues further up the list of prioritization, because as populations move from rural to urban areas, those rural areas may not have the same access to the high level of technology that an urban area may have. Then there's also this issue of the aging population, of course, and for the most part, I think in developed markets, it's fairly well addressed. It's the emerging markets, the markets where people are moving maybe from where we were 20 years ago to in one step to 2024 because of the technology and access and things that they're able to do today that they weren't able to do just because of how the world and the web and access to services have changed. There's that issue. And in both cases, I think it's a question of how do we provide those that are still remaining in the rural environments the same level of care that we can provide to those that are in urban environments? And also, how can we distribute the knowledge that we've gained in developed markets to these emerging markets that are not going to adopt technology at the same adoption curve that developed markets did? They're going to step function move up. It's sort of like back in the day when mobile phones were starting to really become ubiquitous in the 90s. In places in Asia and other parts of the world, they didn't go through the same process of building landlines. Everybody just step function from having no phone or no ubiquitous access to information to instant access to every information that's possible. And this is very true in many parts of the developing world. So there's this question of how do we handle these big shifts in how care is actually accessed and provided. And then finally, the last item I was thinking about was that developing markets we've adopted bad habits, especially as it relates to diet and lifestyle choices. And many of those bad habits are being adopted by emerging markets as they too become wealthy. So that does actually increase the rate of the same diseases that we face: heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. So how can we help those emerging markets? How can we help those people in those rural environments maybe avoid some of those same pitfalls we've had?
So I think there's a couple of really great nuggets in there. So information everywhere has gone up. So demand for some of these services is likely to go up relative to care. But, for access to certain drugs, you might be able to get those out to those rural populations easier than something like a huge proton linear accelerator that costs $100 million to build. You're not going to build that everywhere where everyone can access it.
Right.
And so you'll have this demand for care that's not matched by what you're able to deliver.
exactly. Well said.
And
Well said.
you know, interestingly, so I've worked in cardiovascular disease and oncology, and just even how patients identify. So cancer patients it seems to be cancer is something that happens to them, like there's an enemy that's out there, whereas there's a lot more guilt on the part of the patient who are cardiovascular patients, and we make it out to be their fault when in fact, you know, lifestyle choices can impact both of those things.
Mm-hmm. Very true.
Ron, thinking about the cost of care. So we've said, you know, there's aging population. We got more people out there. I think there's a shortage of primary care doctors, at least in the United States. But care's going up, or cost of care could conceivably go up quite a bit. How do you think about how we ought to be addressing the cost of care as a trend in the healthcare space?
I mean, I think it's a really good question, because the delivery of care isn't the biggest driver of cost, right? A lot of it is, you know, it's a certain population that's using a lot of services, including pharma and specialized pharma, and that really is what drives a lot of the cost of care. I think if you really are concerned about value, it's quality over cost. So you have to think about, can you deliver some aspect of the care in a different modality that then decreases the cost burden? And then can you ferret out value and differentiate value in the same care, so that you can start steering or navigating people towards higher quality care, and thereby higher value care, especially if you start moving the care that's possible to move from bricks and mortar to virtual. And I think you're starting to see that now, where you have businesses that are focused on specific verticals of care delivery, and they're really going after consumers, and trying to kind of take them away from so-called primary care to manage things like menopause or men's health, like Roe, for example. So that's one place where you have a consumer who wants a service, and now they're getting it virtually, and they're taking it away from the traditional system. And they might be paying like an equivalent price, but there's value to that consumer that they're not traveling, they don't have to leave work, they can do it literally in 1 minute. Mm-hmm. The bigger kind of more thorny problems around end of life type high cost care, that's a lot more complicated, because now you're working both with big pharma. So think about the impact of GLP-1s right now. They seem to be wonder drugs when it comes to diabetes, weight loss, anti-inflammatory effects, etc. But there certainly is not going to be an even distribution to those in need. So think about, you know, the developing world, who have adopted many of the bad habits, as we were just talking about in terms of diet, but they will not have access to the GLP-1s and in the near future. So how do we think about that? The last thing I'll say is, from our perspective, one way you can get around cost is to move it A, away from bricks and mortar, and B, away from physicians. So if you don't need care managed by a physician, and you can have it managed by a nurse, or you can have it managed digitally and supervised by a physician, and that's one way to wring out costs. And at CareHive, we're really focused on navigation and making sure that we can get the patient to a place where they can get the same quality care, but they're getting it at a lower price point to them.
So, I mean, again, a couple of nuggets that I find pretty interesting in there. So the number of choices that a healthcare consumer can make is going up by virtue of all these companies going out there. So you can't rely on just going to your doctor to be able to provide everything. And then we've got to disaggregate care in some way so that we can put the care in the most cost-effective folks' hands who are best suited to be able to deliver it as well.
Yeah, there's a phrase that clinicians and systems use as top of license, where you want to put the care in the hands of somebody who's working at the top of the license. And I think digitization, artificial intelligence allows us the opportunity to do that, but we haven't leveraged it to date.
Great point. So Chris, we've talked about largely stuff in the developing world or in the developed world. So United States, Europe, things like that to this point. Thinking about, I know your foundation is something that you focus on quite a bit. So thinking about how things are evolving in the developing world where, we do have countries that are growing substantially. There's a huge demand for healthcare. What are some of the trends that you see, and how does your foundation impact how you're thinking about that?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think I've got two perspectives, I guess, in some ways. One is that we're based in the UK, so we have a national health insurance system that gives quite a different perspective to some of the consumerism comments about US healthcare. We are used to everything being free of charge, or nearly everything free of charge, and supported by a national health service. So that gives a slightly different flavour. But actually, some of the same challenges from an aging population, lack of doctors. There's an article out today on the NHS where you've got the average number of patients per primary healthcare physician has increased by over 15% in the last 5 years. And we're used to universal health coverage, so that for us is a real challenge. We have the same challenge about Dr. Google. There's data everywhere. There's information everywhere, but how do you understand it? We need to find ways to do what Ron was talking about, scale clinicians better. And so I think whilst the context in which we deliver the healthcare is different, actually the challenge is really similar. If I focus on the foundation work we do in particularly Southern Africa, so Sub-Saharan Africa, as a company, as a commercial entity, we have a digital healthcare product that enables us to connect clinicians and patients and make them more scalable. The challenge there is they don't have an aging population, but they have a real challenge around access to healthcare. We talk about massive distances and potentially flying people to different areas. These individuals walk potentially hundreds of miles to get to a healthcare facility. So there's a real dearth of information that they can get access to, and just the prospect of getting access to any clinician, let alone the right clinician, is a real positive impact on someone's health. So how we can find ways to connect those individuals to a healthcare provider, and interestingly, the challenges that they see in terms of their healthcare are largely not cardiovascular disease in the first instance. They're experiencing some challenges around non-communicable diseases, but very much it's about how you get access for essential care. Someone mentioned maternal care earlier. Absolutely, getting maternity care and care for newborn infants is a real challenge in some of these communities in the developing world.
It's like you were hitting me a softball here, because I wanted to talk about data next, and you said data everywhere. So, we talked about this being an integrated healthcare panel. We talked about some very much real world trends out there, access to care, aging populations, how we need to think about that. I want us to shift into this idea of there is a treasure trove of data that's out there, and it exists, but our ability to use it is compromised somewhat. Greg, going to you first on this. Thinking about action and information. So, we've got, Medicare claims that should be giving us a good idea of what's going on with the patient. But if you try and read any of that stuff, it's not readable by the layman that's out there. So how do you think about moving some of this data that we've got out there to information and how we can act on things?
That's a great question. And I think that, the way that I've been thinking about it and the product approach that we've taken is what we've discovered is if you can ingest, the claims data of an individual, right, that has some history. I'm not talking about, a couple months, but like a Medicare member with, let's call it a couple of years. In my case, my mom's got 2 decades, right? You can extract using technology. Let's go with AI, right? And use it as a translation layer just to take those ICD codes, all the codes, right? That is the medical terminology and extract it to a public facing, again, consumer first version of what is avorvastatin. I didn't probably pronounce that right. Sorry. Or this medication or that medication, or this diagnosis or that diagnosis. You can string together a timeline of people's events so you can look at their health journey. This stuff is, when we started playing around with the Medicare, this is what we're doing at least. And then, so once you have someone's health journey on the past, and it's sort of like the map, but it also tells you where to go for the clinical if you need that test result, or you need to get in touch with that doctor or figure out who referred who to that, right, as you're chasing down the charts for whatever reason. Getting more and more significantly easier and easier to do. We're not there yet, right? But I think those are the types of things that we're going to see in terms of access to data, paint the health journey, figure out how to get the finer details if we need, or let's call it the metadata. And, how do we make it actionable was your question, right? And so again, with technology, we can see things that in my world, I call them care minders. That's what we're building in. If we have a set of data on someone, know their chronic conditions or their constellation of chronic conditions, and here in the US, we have a lot of that. What medications they're on, who their doctors are, we can start looking at things like basic stuff, the annual wellness, the follow-up visits that didn't take place, the medications that may be up for prescription refill, just reminders on potential exacerbations and complications that could take place with somebody based on a set of conditions that we saw just in the claims data, right? There's all these things that can nudge people in the right direction to maybe, I've also learned a lot of this, and this is a kind of a scary thought when I think about it, when you talk about actioning data. But I've found, and maybe some of the other folks on the panel have, with healthcare, I mean, sometimes just asking the right question or hearing the right piece of information is the difference between someone's life or death, or the health fund they should on because of a piece of information. And so that I just think we're going to see more and more of that. Again, taking the consumer first, i.e. the caregiver, and bringing them a seat at the table. The whole idea is we can get a PHR, a personal health record on somebody, but it's just that, right? It's just another data vault, right, of personal health information. The real magic is making it actionable and nudging people in the direction, whether it's the actual patient themselves or, in my case, the care team around them.
Okay, so both massive positive and massive negative. The information is out there, but we're not necessarily using it the best way possible without a lot of help. Ron,
yeah.
Ron, when we're thinking about how you guys are using the data that's out there, what do the data that you guys look at, why do you think it's not being used properly now? And how does that open up our opportunity to actually use this information better to either provide better care on a macro level to a system or micro care to an individual? As Greg was saying, like, not having the right information can be the difference between life and death for individuals.
Yeah, I think it might be legacy simply because data has always been available, but it's been very, very, very siloed. And then trying to put it together to make sense of it has been very, very, very difficult. When I started thinking about data in the clinic, because I was very interested in how you could use clinic data to help predict whether somebody needed to be seen in the office or whether you can actually manage them virtually. It was back in the days of, client servers, and you'd have a big server station somewhere or a server warehouse. And then if you wanted to put together different data sets, it was extremely difficult. And the big repositories of data are typically the system or the health plan, the payer. nowadays, with the advent of the cloud, you have the capacity to link together data sets and do large-scale data analysis with relative ease. And for the big players, the plans to catch up, they have access to it, but to leverage it and then to use it specifically predictively, to understand what diagnosis might actually run with another diagnosis that puts somebody at a higher risk, or how can we leverage the data we have to say that this person needs to be seen sooner or proactively, as opposed to the classic reactive way that people engage with the healthcare system. And that's really that's how we're leveraging data, both to help navigate the patient to the appropriate site for service, and then understand the risk. Because in healthcare, if you think about me practicing clinically as a doctor, I would see patients in the office or in the hospital with various severity of their illness, and some of them needed to be in that environment, some of them didn't. They just ended up there. The best example was, I'd be seeing a patient. I'd have 2 clinic visits back to back. I'd have 15 minutes, and I would see a URI, otherwise known as a cold, and then I'd have a heart failure exacerbation. I'd have the same amount of time for them, and I needed a lot more time to figure out what I'm going to do with a heart failure person than I do with a cold who I didn't think I needed to see. And now you can actually leverage the data in such a way to say, these are the people that we need to really worry about, and we should actually seek them out and figure out what to do with them proactively, as opposed to other people who have less risk. So you can stratify and target. And that's really how at CareHive we think about leveraging data. The last thing I will say, and I'll be very quick about it, is that you can also use data to model the return on investment to whoever you're working with. So if you model the return on investment to the plan, instead of waiting for 12 months for claims to come through, you can actually model, as a patient's going through an intervention, the return on investment using data science as well.
Well, I think you touch on a big piece of this is that ROI and getting paid by those payers, right? And I think that with predictive modeling is awesome from a patient care perspective, but how do the providers actually get paid? And we see on our, in our world routinely, it's just deny until we can go back through and prove that the care was necessary. And so I have to have a team of people, because we're currently not leveraging some of the AI solutions that we probably need to move towards. But we have to have a team of people putting together, it's sometimes a 30 or 40 page packet on every patient to explain to the plans why they needed to pay for this life-saving care that we're providing. I think that just illustrates another challenge, is how do we get the payers on board with this predictive idea and utilizing the data in an appropriate way.
So that, we've got these payers, they've got an immense amount of data. Ron, you said we're able to combine this in a way that we couldn't before. That's one of the big benefits of where we are today. Thinking about this from your perspective, Chris, NHS being centralized, and really they're holding the spot that our payers really hold here in the United States. They've got all this data. What are their demands of you when we're thinking about the usage of data? What do they want to know more about, and where are they trying to get that from?
So annoyingly, it's a slight misconception that we hold all the data in one spot, Matt. Whilst the NHS is effectively one brand, we have lots of different data silos that sit within the NHS. So we have some of the same challenges that you guys have. What we do have is a really good primary care data set. So a really good data set of 50 odd million people with comprehensive healthcare coverage. So the asks essentially are around how we share and transfer data. What becomes a really big challenge, however, is that rightly we are very sensitive about how we share data. But I was in a recent meeting with the NHS England board where they said that to make a decision happen across the country, they had to get consent from over 500 data protection officers to get one decision to go through. So you were literally, you were having to jump through so many hurdles because of the required security levels of the data that to make joined up thinking actually work effectively and to get the insights that you want from that data that's held, it can become a real challenge. So what are the asks on the system? One, keep the data secure, and two, share it where you can. But the emphasis is very much on data security and integrity before it's on how you get the best leverage from the data for patient benefit.
Well, I think it's a very real problem in terms of being able to get these data pieces connected from place to place. Jacob, when we're thinking about, you're focused a lot on what the care path looks like for physicians and for patients out there. The amount of information that we got, how is that actually helping us deliver better care overall? And how do you think about this opportunity that we've got with tremendous amounts of data, which, as Chris mentioned, in all cases, it seems like it's sitting in a lot of silos.
Yeah, and it still is in cancer care, I think, very much so, which tends to be a focus of ours. What we find, though, is that a lot of the data isn't clean enough or of sufficiently relatable quality where one can actually glean insights necessarily. I'm sure you could, model and send data through models for summarization and for extracting interesting features and things like that. But reality is that especially in cancer care, you need randomized controlled trials. And a lot of those randomized controlled trials result in meaningful information. There's so much in oncology care that provides just a tiny, tiny bit of an improvement at an incredibly high cost. And the entire pharma industry is based on that, where you can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars and then increase lifespan by 2 months. And most of that time is spent dealing with side effects. So I think that there is a little bit of a, chasing after windmills type of aspect of trying to mine data, at least in cancer care, from the electronic medical record and somehow glean insight from a clinical decision support perspective, unless you have data that was manufactured properly and there's a good relatable aspects to that data. With that said, though, there is an opportunity, I think, for us to use data, especially highly detailed time series data on who did what, when, and where, to optimize the overall care delivery for everybody, for the patient, for the providers, as well as for those who are paying. And so we've been focusing primarily on how can we look at how care is delivered and then determine how we can optimize that care delivery using the data that's generated.
Well, I think your point's really well taken when we're thinking about the new types of care that come out. It is way easier to quantify months of life than to quantify quality of life around it. And so we're stuck in this spot where it's just like, how do we provide better care? Well, it's really hard to measure how well someone's doing. And so we're going to opt towards, can we make them live for another 2 months?
Yeah, and that's a big part of, I think, overall Western society. Even living horribly for 2 months is still living for 2 months because we don't know what's going to happen after we stop living. And I think that that's a big part of how Western medicine is set up in such a way that you can spend vast amounts of societal resources on essentially an end stage that is rather unoptimal or poorly optimized for everyone, including the patient involved. So those are tough questions, but we have an industry, I think, that is favorable to providing survival at all cost. And I think each individual family needs to sort of make that decision for themselves. But sometimes just living where you're constantly in bed and dealing with all sorts of toxicities and not really having a good quality of life, that's not really living either. So anyway.
Ben, I got one question for you, and then we're going to go to some of the questions that we've got in the chat. But so Ben, you mentioned earlier, the ability to actually talk to payers and make sure that they have the justification. That's something where you're seeing value in terms of putting a digital solution in like AI or something like that to help you on that path. What other tools would you like to be able to see to help you in your business, whether it's through the vast amount of data that's out there, or any particular innovations in another area of the digital world that you would like to see actually make its way into LifeFlight's business?
I mean, I think there's if all the data that we have access to could somehow be integrated, right, so that you could get a detailed account of both the individual patient and then representative populations of the patients, so that you could make better care decisions. And I think that there's so much power there, because I think, Ron mentioned earlier, like it could be just one piece that you're missing, right, or that you need that's important to figure out what the care is. And if you have rapid access to that, we could do interventions for our business in the air. We're a little flying ICU, but if we know if we had rapid access at the hospital, the sending facility, immediately of what this patient's other maybe comorbidities are, we could make better decisions while we're transporting. So that would be really intriguing. But getting all that coalesced is going to be a real challenge.
Well, we've done a very good job in the United States of creating layers to healthcare and a lot of middlemen in different spots. So that does not help us in this circumstance. So one of the questions that got asked in the chat was, what's the best way to access the data being talked about? So we're talking about all these different pieces of data overall that are in different spots. How can we actually do a better job of accessing it? And I would like to open that up to anyone who's willing to shout out how, what can we do, different ways of looking at data. Jacob, you just came off mute. Why don't you have a...
Yeah. And I think that this is the general question is, how can I build, I have some ideas. I have some interest inside some specific vertical in healthcare. How can I engage in that vertical and build some solution that could bring tremendous value? I have some interesting ideas I'd like to try out. So my recommendation is, and this will answer the question related specifically to data, is to identify key domain experts, folks that are in the industry that are actually practicing medicine today, and go to them and share your ideas with them. If you're living in an urban setting and you can draw a 25-mile radius around where you live, I'm sure you can find one or more experts in practically every vertical in healthcare that would be interested in working with you. Once you get them to understand the concept, and once you sort of reconcile maybe your misconception with what's actually happening, and you get them on board, they're going to be your advocate to access that data, and they will show you how to access that data. So there are many different ways to access the data once you get there, but if you're coming out with a solution and you're going to pitch that solution to a health system or a vendor, they're receiving these pitches hundreds of times per day, and you'd likely get absolutely zero traction. So the best thing is start with one person in the field, do the research, go to that physician or go to that clinical person and say, hey, I have this idea, what do you think? Fine tune your idea, and they will send you through the right path within their organization to give you access to that data.
Okay, increased data access through the providers that are already there that can help us on a micro level, thinking about how we actually can expand around it. Other ideas on how we can increase our access to data and the right data that's out there.
Matt, Chris here. I think there are...
I'm not gonna, can you hear me?
Oh, let's let Chris go, and then we'll have Greg go.
For me, I think there are two elements, and I guess it depends what data sets you're talking about. There are so many that there's potentially a really broad answer. I think, the existing suggestion of go and find someone to talk to who is a functional expert is exactly right. I would extend that a bit broader, that there are certainly in case of the NHS, there are lots of data sets that are released publicly by the NHS. So frankly, if you want to go and look at the NHS data set, you can go and look at an anonymized data set by using Google and looking on the NHS centrally. We've also had great success by when we have a concept or an idea, talking to insurance companies and talking to them directly. And as long as there's a purpose to doing that, they're usually quite happy to give a limited amount of data to explore a proposal that might have some mutual benefit for them as well. So I guess my overriding would be talk about your idea and don't be afraid to go and ask people, because there is plenty of data out there. Getting insight from that data is what most people want from it. And if you can help them to do that, then they're usually fairly happy to share.
I was just going to really echo what Chris said. It depends on the data. And
sorry,
yes.
Greg.
No, it's perfect. You did a great job articulating it.
But so I think, to that point, Greg, Medicare, your ability to even download the claims, like they're trying to help people access the data, and people aren't necessarily doing it.
No, they're trying. I mean, if you go to, Medicare's they're on the second version of their Blue Button 2.0 API for the claims that they update on a regular basis. The data's there. There's different tool sets that you can access it and download it. And really, it's to what Chris just said, it's another data vault. You need to action the data, get insights from it. It needs to tell you a story, a narrative, and empower you in some way, shape, or form to do something with it. I just think we're going to see a lot more of that. Where I started was claims data, again, the health journey and the history for the loved, for the aging loved ones in our lives. But I just think that, it's going to get easier to be able to derive sort of information out of the healthcare data that's available to us. And I'm talking like life beyond the portals for personalized information for somebody in an Epic or Cerner type situation. It's all going to just get easier and easier to transform and to translate for folks. So I just think you're going to see a lot of this coming. And I think we're in the third inning of it. But I don't think going to be an easy. I don't think there's ever going to be an easy button for healthcare yet. It'd be great if there was, but.
Ron or Ben, anything you'd like to add on that?
No, I would just echo what folks said. I do think that there is data out there. So, for example, all the plans are required to release cost transparency data. That's a new requirement as of the past couple of years. It's out there, but it's not easy to understand. So a consumer can find it, can get to it, but it's, you downloaded some funky CSV file with a weird format that you really need to be a data scientist to interpret. But I think as Jacob and Greg said, it's out there. It's just going to take a little bit of time before we can really access it with some simplicity. And then it's a matter of figuring out what you're going to do with the data. That's going to create some sort of value.
Ben, anything you'd like to add around that? I mean, I think one of the things that's standing out to me, though, is there's a really interesting conflict that we're seeing in messaging. So for consumers, you've got things like Facebook being free, Google being free, and it's because these companies are absorbing so much data, and there's a lot of value in the data. And we're saying, hey, if you go out and ask some of these companies, they're willing to give it to you, or sometimes they are mandated to. So the value of data is not something that we really are doing a good job of figuring out at this point in, basically any aspect of our lives. So, thinking about how we can assess that value is really important. We only got 8 minutes left. And so, a lot of interesting conversations that we've had thus far. I want to open it up for either any additional questions that we might have from the audience, or you guys having questions for each other. Wanted to create some space for that. So I'll open up the floor.
I think one of the things that we haven't, we've touched on it, but we haven't really dug too deeply into is just thoughts from the team on the implications of the current stage of AI advancement, and especially transitioning from what prior to maybe a couple of years ago was more deterministically run, I guess you could say healthcare, to something that might be a combination of deterministic models and probabilistic models. So just sort of a general question. Gen AI is just part of it, but there's so many other potential implications.
And I tried to stay away from AI a little bit because it's a panacea and boogeyman at the same time, but would love to hear, what you have to say. Ben, I think you were going off of mute.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that obviously there's dangers to AI if it's not implemented correctly, but at the same time, I think if we look at the problems that we're trying to solve in healthcare and you view generative AI as a tool in which to solve those problems, I don't think that we should look to use it just because it's there, right? As CEOs, we shouldn't be like, hey, I want to use AI. It's like saying, I want to use the internet, from 20 years ago. Like, let's do that at our company. What problems are we trying to solve, and then how can it be helpful? And then we just have to be really cautious about, because I've experimented with it a reasonable bit. It can be very confident in a very wrong answer, and so that's where the human element and figuring out what are our protections against that. And so there's a gotcha there, but I think as Bill Gates has said multiple times, this will be bigger than the internet. And so how do we harness that?
Yeah. I would just echo to say that in the term nascent, but I do think in terms of the transformation and the use of the utility of AI, particularly in healthcare, it's just, I'm looking at it from a translation tool, so a human AI perspective. Let's just take that and translate it. Don't tell me anything about it. Really basic, right? But that ICD code 012 means nothing to 99.9% of the population. So, okay, that's a lab test. Whew, I know what's up. But now and then there's also the ability, there's not much empowerment in there. I know what that is now, right? And so then it bakes into the bigger thing. And that goes for conditions and doctors and all these different things. But when you think about the vision side of it and the voice side of it, that's just now starting to pop up. The implications for this are insane. I'll give you one example. In my R&D, which is basically my life is R&D, real-time R&D and caregiver, I was like, I wonder if I could take the lab slip and the clinical notes from my mom's PCP visit just on Monday and just snapshot it with computer vision and get an analysis, put it in a data format that I could then pop right into my app. Did it in 30 seconds and was 100% spot on. Your mom's getting tested for this is the patient information. Obviously, I have a GPT, PHI, and all that stuff have to be addressed in terms of data protection. But the actual task I asked it to do, to put it in a file to append it to my mom's personal health record, took 3 seconds, is 100% accurate. It also will allow me to fill in the last mile on a viewpoint of somebody from a claims perspective, which, as we all know, was, at least in the US, 30 to 60 days at best in the past from happening, and fill in the last mile of what's going on with the patient really quickly. Active meds, active doctors, anything that can happen like that. So there's just, I just think it's really early, and we haven't wrapped our head around all the different implications of AI yet with healthcare. And I look at it very much as the individual level versus the cohort population level. So it's an interesting thing to be playing around with on a daily basis.
Ron, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, I like to think of it from a low-hanging fruit perspective. I have probably a bias as a clinician. There's a lot of burnout and overwhelming of the physician, really on the primary care, but across most specialties. And you can leverage, think about leveraging AI to get rid of some of that burden. That's where I think it's not endangering anybody, because you're not asking the AI to make clinical decisions. You're just asking it to create documents that can be reviewed by a clinician, for example, or create a visualization that might make it easier for a patient to interpret a test, as Greg was referring to. So I like to think about AI as being able to solve some of those really early low-hanging fruit problems. And it's already involved in aiding on certain decision making when it comes to radiology is a great example. That's a very fruitful, useful leveraging of AI. Again, always okayed by a licensed clinician, but really, the decision is aided by the AI.
Great. Chris, anything you'd like to add on?
I guess just one last quick one, really. So the software that we have is regulated as a medical device, and that means that there are certain additional hoops for AI to jump through that are really relevant. So we primarily use AI currently, but I'm sure this will evolve for the first stage of doing things, and then we're having real people checking to make sure that it's robust and that the validation processes that we need are there. And actually, it's worth saying, often they're not quite yet. So for a first iteration, for a first attempt, it seems to work really effectively. But actually, for an end product, it doesn't quite get us to where we need yet. Certainly in most of the work that we're doing. What the future holds, my kids are probably better placed to tell us.
Well, with that, we are at the top of the hour. Excellent discussion. Thanks so much for sharing your perspectives. Obviously, we've got the whole healthcare industry figured out right now. So, great things coming and they will happen immediately. But all kidding aside, there is a lot more to learn for us all on the path towards ideally better care and more efficient care as well. Thanks a ton to you guys. Look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.